The morning Susan Whitfield stood at the grave of the man who had destroyed her life, she expected to feel nothing but relief, and the fact that she was weeping shattered her in ways even his cruelty never had. The year was 1874, and the Arizona Territory was the kind of place that swallowed people whole if they were not careful. The land was vast and burning and indifferent, the sky an endless dome of scorched blue that offered no shelter and no answers. Red rock formations rose from the desert floor like the ruins of some ancient civilization, and the wind carried dust and the faint smell of creosote across every mile of open ground. It was a land that demanded strength, and Susan Whitfield had spent the better part of 3 years convincing herself that she possessed it. She was 28 years old, tall for a woman of her era, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat when she was working, and let fall across her shoulders in the evenings when there was no one to see her. Her eyes were the color of deep water, a blue so dark it edged toward gray, and there were fine lines forming at their corners from squinting into the relentless Arizona sun. She was not fragile in appearance or in fact. She had homesteaded 40 acres east of the town of Red Rock Crossing, had sunk a well with her own 2 hands and her late husband's tools, had grown enough to get by and sometimes a little more. She was a woman who knew how to survive. What she had not known how to do was stop hating Franklin Holt. Franklin Holt had been her neighbor, her tormentor, and for 3 long years the reason she fell asleep at night with her jaw so tightly clenched that she woke with headaches. He had been the man who had contested her land claim after her husband Edgar died, who had bribed the county land office clerk to delay her filing until he could submit a competing claim on the eastern portion of her property. He had sent his ranch hands to trample her irrigation ditches twice in the summer of 1872. He had stood on the steps of the Red Rock Crossing General Store and told anyone who would listen that a widow woman alone had no business running 40 acres and that somebody ought to relieve her of the burden. He had made her life a slow and grinding misery, and she had fought him every single step of the way, and she had won barely, uglily, at tremendous cost to her savings and her peace of mind. And now Franklin Holt was dead. He had died 4 days ago of a heart failure, which the doctor in Red Rock Crossing said was the most natural thing in the world for a man of 53 who ate the way Franklin Holt had eaten and drank the way Franklin Holt had drunk. There was no mystery to it, no drama, no justice in it that Susan could properly name. He had simply stopped, the way a clock stops, and the world had moved on without him. His family, a sister who lived in Tucson and a nephew who had ridden out from Flagstaff, had buried him that morning in the small cemetery at the edge of the Holt property, a quarter-mile from the boundary line that separated his land from hers. Susan had watched the procession from a distance, standing at her fence line with her arms crossed and her face closed off, feeling the hard, cold satisfaction she had been waiting 3 years to feel. But then the procession had gone, and the nephew and the sister had climbed into their wagon and driven back toward Red Rock Crossing, and Susan had stood there a moment longer, and then, without entirely understanding why, she had walked across the boundary and through the sparse juniper trees and had stood at the mound of freshly turned earth that was Franklin Holt's grave. And that was when the tears came. They were not the tears she had expected, if she had expected any at all. They were not tears of grief in any conventional sense. They were something more complicated and more terrible than simple grief. They were the tears of a woman who had organized 3 years of her life around fighting a man, and who suddenly found that the organizing principle was gone. They were the tears of exhaustion, of rage that had no longer anywhere to go. They were the tears of a woman who realized, standing at the grave of her enemy, that she did not know who she was when she was not fighting. She wept with one hand pressed to her mouth and the other fisted at her side, her shoulders shaking, her hat pushed back on her head, the Arizona wind pulling strands of her dark hair loose across her wet cheeks. She wept, and she did not hear the horse approaching until it was very close, and by then she was too deep in it to stop. Matthew Finley reined in his horse at the edge of the cemetery clearing and went very still. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending most of one's waking life outdoors. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting, curling slightly over the collar of his canvas shirt, and his eyes were a warm amber brown that caught the light in a way that made people feel, inexplicably, that he was paying attention to them specifically. He had a quiet quality about him, a steadiness that was not coldness. He was simply a man who thought before he spoke, and who had learned, through long experience, that most things were better understood than judged. He had ridden through from the direction of Redrock, crossing on his way to the Holt property, where he had been told by Tom Garfield at the livery stable that old Franklin Holt's family might need some help arranging the transport of Holt's cattle to the sale yard in Tucson. Matthew did occasional work of that kind. He was not, strictly speaking, a cowhand for hire anymore, but he knew cattle and he knew the country, and he helped out where he could. He had not expected to find a woman weeping at a grave. He sat on his horse and looked at her for a moment, and he did not ask who she was or why she was crying or whether she was all right. He simply dismounted, looped his horse's reins over a nearby juniper branch, and walked to the edge of the grave, where he removed his hat and stood quietly a few feet away from her. Susan heard his footsteps and stiffened, pulling in a sharp breath, pressing both hands to her face for a moment, and then dropping them and turning to look at him with the particular dignified defiance of a woman who has been caught in a moment she had not intended to share. He did not say anything. He just stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the grave, as though he had every reason in the world to be standing in that spot, and as though her presence there was entirely unremarkable. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look at her. He looked at the grave. She turned back to the grave too, and they stood there together in silence, the wind moving between them, the red dust settling on the turned earth, and after a moment she found that the desperate pressure in her chest had eased somewhat, just from not being alone. "I did not like him," she said finally. Her voice was hoarse. She was not apologizing exactly, but she felt the need to say it. "I did not know him well," he said. His voice was low and even and carried no judgment in it whatsoever. "I am Susan Whitfield," she said. "My land is just there." She gestured vaguely east without looking at him. "Matthew Finley," he said. He still was not looking at her. "I came out about his cattle." She nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist in a quick, efficient motion, as though she were wiping dust from her face rather than tears. "The family has gone back to town," she said. "I do not think they will be back until tomorrow." "That is all right," he said. "I can wait." And somehow, simply because he said it without making anything of it, she believed him. She believed that he was the kind of man who could wait without making her feel as though waiting was a burden, without making her feel as though she owed him an explanation for any of it. She did not know how she knew this about a stranger she had met 60 seconds ago, but she knew it the way she knew other things about people, instinctively, from the way he stood and the way he held his silence. "I should get back to my property," she said. "Yes," he said, as though she had stated something perfectly sensible. She looked at him again sideways, and he finally looked back at her, and she saw in his amber eyes something she had not expected, not pity, not curiosity, not the calculating look of a man who had just filed away a piece of information about a woman to use later. Just a kind of plain, uncomplicated recognition, as though he looked at her and saw a person. She nodded once, put her hat straight on her head, and walked back through the juniper trees toward her land. Matthew Finley watched her go. Then he put his hat back on and went attend to his horse. He did not ask any questions, not then, and not later when he learned, as he inevitably did in a small place like Redrock Crossing, exactly who Susan Whitfield was and what Franklin Holt had meant to her. He learned it in pieces, the way you learned most things in a small frontier town. From Tom Garfield at the livery, who mentioned the land dispute when they were talking about Holt's cattle. From the woman behind the counter at the general store who said something about how that poor widow Whitfield had finally gotten some peace. From the barber who had more opinions than anyone had asked for about what was proper for a woman alone. Matthew took it all in and said very little and thought about the way she had stood at that grave with her shoulders shaking and her fist at her side, all her grief and her rage and her exhaustion pouring out of her into the red Arizona dust. He thought about her more than he should have, for a man who had only met her for 3 minutes. 3 days later, he had a reason to call on her. One of Holt's longhorn cattle had broken through the fence line and gotten into what he now knew was Susan Whitfield's property. He had been working out on the Holt spread, helping sort and inventory the herd for the estate sale, when one of the ranch hands pointed it out. Matthew had offered to ride over and deal with it himself, partly because it was the neighborly thing to do and partly because he was a man honest enough with himself to admit that he wanted to see her again. He found her in the yard behind her house, splitting firewood. She had taken off her jacket and was working in her shirt sleeves, her hat on a fence post, her dark hair braided down her back. She was not small and she was not soft, and she swung the axe with a competence that said she had been doing this for a long time without anyone's help. She heard him ride up and straightened, turning to look at him with the calm, measuring gaze of a woman on a working homestead who assessed every arrival for what it might cost her. Then she recognized him and something shifted slightly in her expression, not quite softening but settling. "Mr. Finley," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "One of Holt's longhorns has gotten through your east fence. I came to get it back before it did any damage to your crops." She set the axe down against the chopping block and reached for her jacket. "I will show you where the fence line is," she said. "I appreciate it," he said. She pulled on her jacket, took her hat from the fence post, and set it on her head with the ease of someone who had worn a hat outdoors every day of their adult life. Then she went to the small lean-to barn at the edge of the yard and brought out a sorrel mare, saddled her with efficient, practiced movements, and swung up without asking for help or waiting to see if he would offer it. He did not offer it. He watched, and he noted, and he respected what he saw. They rode east together along the edge of her cultivated land, where she had corn growing in rows that were straight and clearly tended with care, and further along some vegetable beds that were surrounded by rough stone borders to hold in what little moisture the land offered. Matthew looked at all of it with an eye shaped by his own years of working the land, and what he saw was not a woman failing in her enterprise, but a woman succeeding at it against significant odds. "You run this alone?" he asked. It was a plain question, not a challenging one. "With seasonal help for harvest," she said. "Mostly alone," he nodded. They found the longhorn, a young steer, grazing peacefully near the broken section of fence, and he dismounted and worked the animal back through while she watched from horseback, and then he looked at the fence and said, "This section has been weak for a while. It will need 2 new posts at a minimum." "I know," she said. "I have the posts. I have not had the time." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, and he could see she was not asking him for help, but she was also not refusing it if it was offered, and there was a particular kind of pragmatic dignity in that position that he found he admired enormously. "I have the afternoon," he said. "If you can show me where the posts are." She studied him for a moment, reading him the way people who lived alone and had to be careful read everyone who came close. Then she said, "All right." They fixed the fence together. It was not romantic in any obvious sense. It was hot work, driving posts into the hard Arizona earth, stringing wire, testing the tension. But there was something about working alongside another person that was its own kind of intimacy. She handed him tools before he asked for them. He noticed when the ground was too rocky to drive the post straight, and suggested a slightly different angle without making her feel as though she had been doing it wrong. They talked a little about the cattle, about the land, about the dry summer they were having, and mostly they worked in a silence that was comfortable in a way that neither of them remarked upon, because to remark upon it would have been to break it. When they were done, she said, "Come up to the house. I will make coffee." It was not an impulsive invitation. She said it the way she did everything, after she had thought about it and decided it was what she meant to do. Her house was small and very clean. 2 rooms, with a covered porch on the south side. The furniture was plain and well made, and there were small things about it that told him something about who she was. A row of books on a shelf above the fireplace, a pieced quilt on the chair by the window, a tin of what turned out to be dried lavender hanging from one of the rafters because she had told him once she had read that it kept certain insects away, though she had added dryly that she was not convinced it worked. He had laughed at that genuinely, and she had looked at him with a slightly startled expression, as though she had not quite expected him to laugh at that particular kind of thing, and then she had smiled, just briefly, just the edge of it, and it had rearranged something in the architecture of his chest. They sat on the porch with their coffee, and the late afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, golden and long, turning the dust in the yard to something almost beautiful. He asked her about her land claim, not the details of the dispute which he had already heard, but what she had built there, what she planned for it. She answered him with the precision of someone who had given these questions a great deal of thought, who had plans and contingencies and a clear sense of what she was working toward. She talked about the well, about an irrigation scheme she had been thinking about for the lower field, about the possibility of adding a few head of cattle of her own once the finances allowed. He listened, and he asked questions, and the questions were good ones, the kind that showed he understood what she was saying. She found herself, somewhere in the middle of talking about the irrigation scheme, thinking that she had not talked to anyone like this in a very long time. She had talked to townspeople about the weather and supplies and the price of corn. She had talked to her lawyer, a thin, careful man in Tucson, about the land claim. She had talked to no one, not really, about what she was building here and why. She stopped herself in the middle of a sentence and looked at him. "You are easy to talk to," she said, and it came out more plainly than she had intended, without the careful qualifier she might have added if she had thought it through. He looked at her with those amber eyes that caught the late light and held it. "So are you," he said, and then, after a pause, "I have not had much of that in a while either." She did not ask him what he meant, not yet, but she filed it away. He left before dark. He rode back toward Red Rock Crossing, and she stood on her porch and watched him go, and she told herself very firmly that he was a man who was passing through, that men like him were always passing through, that she had built her life on this 40 acres, and she was not going to let herself be pulled away from it by the warmth of an afternoon's conversation. She went inside and made her supper and read by lamplight and went to bed. She thought about him anyway. Matthew was staying at the hotel in Red Rock Crossing, which was 2 stories of weathered timber with 4 rooms to let, and a dining room that served a plain but adequate meal twice a day. He had been in town for a week now, working the Holt estate arrangement, and he had told himself that once the cattle were sorted and the paperwork was done he would move on. He had work in Flagstaff he had been thinking about, a man named Creighton who ran a modest cattle operation and had mentioned needing someone to help organize a drive north in the fall. He lay on the narrow hotel bed that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way she had smiled, just the edge of it, at the lavender comment, and about the irrigation scheme she had described with such quiet, determined precision, and about the moment at the grave when she had said, "I did not like him," in that hoarse, honest voice that was not apologizing and not explaining, just stating what was true. He thought about her more than the Flagstaff job, which was supposed to be what he was thinking about. He came back the next week on a different errand. He had found, at the Holt property, a section of extra fence wire that the estate's nephew had said he had no use for, and that Matthew thought might be useful to someone. He told himself this was the only reason he was riding east. She was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees pulling weeds from around the bean plants with the single-minded focus of someone who understood that a weed you let go today would cost you twice the work tomorrow. She looked up when she heard the horse, and when she saw it was him her expression did that thing again. It did not quite soften, but it settled, the way a room settles when a door opens and the right kind of air comes in. "Mr. Finley," she said. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. He had the wire coil tied to his saddle. He explained where it had come from and why he thought she might be able to use it. She looked at it for a moment with that measuring look, and then she said, "Thank you, that is practical of you." It was not effusive, and he did not want it to be. He found he preferred her particular brand of directness to any amount of flowery speech. "I wondered," he said, and then he stopped, because he was not entirely certain how to say what he wanted to say, which was not something he was accustomed to. He was generally a man who knew his own mind. "I wondered whether you would want company for supper. There is a dining room at the hotel in town." She looked at him from the garden, her hands still dark with earth, her hat tilted back on her head, and there was a long pause in which he could see her thinking it through with that same careful deliberateness she brought to everything. "I would want to clean up first," she said. He waited on the porch. When she came out, she had washed and changed into a dress that was simple and dark blue and well-fitted, and she had her hair pinned up under a different hat, and she looked like herself, but in a form he had not seen yet, and he found that both versions of her, the one in shirt-sleeves with an axe and the one in the dark blue dress, were the same woman, and he was very interested in both of them. They rode into Red Rock Crossing together in the early evening, the sky doing its thing that Arizona skies did at that hour, going from blue to orange to rose in a wash of color that was almost excessive, and she pointed out various things along the road. A particular rock formation she used as a landmark, the place where a creek ran underground that you could find if you knew where to look, and he listened and remembered all of it. The hotel dining room was occupied by a few other travelers and the town's part-time telegraph operator, a round man named Dillard who nodded at them and then went back to his meal. The proprietress, a solid woman called Mrs. Harmon, brought them a meal of beef stew with cornbread and coffee, and Matthew noticed the way she looked at Susan with a particular warmth that said there was a history there, some form of loyalty or protectiveness. Afterward he learned the shape of it when Mrs. Harmon paused at their table on the way back to the kitchen and said quietly, "Good to see you out, Mrs. Whitfield. You spend too much time alone out there." "I am fine, Ruth," Susan said, with the patient tone of someone who had said this before. "Mrs. Harmon looked at Matthew with an assessing gaze that reminded him of a woman who has been watching out for someone and needs to know whether the person now sitting across from her represents a help or a hindrance. He met her eyes plainly, and she seemed to arrive at some internal conclusion and went back to her kitchen. "She has known you a while," he said. "She has been in this town as long as I have," Susan said. 8 years. She and her husband ran this place together until he died of the fever in '71. She knows what it is to manage alone." He nodded. "And you," he said, "how long have you been in Arizona?" 8 years, she said. "My husband Edgar and I came out from Ohio in '66. He had the land claim filed by '67 and we built the first house, just 2 rooms, smaller than what is there now in the summer of that year. He died in the spring of '71. Fever, he asked, because it was the most common thing. A fall, she said, without particular drama. From the roof. He was fixing a section where the weather had gotten in. It was a simple accident." She paused. "He was a good man. Not without his difficulties, but a good man. I miss him most at certain practical moments, when there is something heavy that needs moving, or a decision that would have benefited from 2 minds." He heard what she was saying, that she had grieved her husband, had moved through it, and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it that was not bitterness but was also not pretending. He appreciated the honesty of it. "I have not been married," he said. "I came close once in '70, but she married someone else while I was away on a drive. She made the right choice. He was a better fit for her." Susan looked at him with a slight tilt of her head, as though she was trying to determine whether he was being honest or performing some kind of stoic acceptance. He could see her arriving at the conclusion that he was being honest. "You take that very calmly," she said. "I was not calm about it at the time," he said, but it was 3 years ago and I have had time to see it clearly." He paused. "I think the truth is that I was in love with the idea of a certain kind of life more than I was in love with her specifically. That is not a flattering admission, but I believe it is accurate." She considered that for a moment. "That is very self-aware," she said finally, and there was something in her voice that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, a kind of recognition, as though she was placing him in some internal category she had not previously had a slot for. They walked back out through the town after supper, into the warm dark of the Arizona evening, the stars coming out in their thousands above the low-roofed buildings and the open desert beyond. She had tied her mare to the post outside the hotel, and he had his horse there too, and for a moment they stood together in the dark with the sounds of the town around them. Voices from the saloon down the street, the creak of someone's wagon passing, a dog somewhere in the distance. And there was a quality to the quiet between them that was new, a warmth that had not been there when they were fixing fence together, but that had been building across the weeks, slowly and carefully, like her irrigation plans. "This was pleasant," she said. "Thank you." "Yes, it was," he said. "I hope we can do it again." She looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them moved to rush anything, and there was something in that shared understanding that was more intimate than anything else they had shared. She knew he meant it, and she knew he would wait for her pace, and he knew she was beginning to trust him, and they both knew this without saying it. She rode home under the Arizona stars, and he watched her go from the hotel steps. The next 2 months had a quality that Matthew would later describe, to himself and then eventually to her, as the best kind of slow. He had told Creighton in Flagstaff that he needed another few weeks, and then another few after that, and Creighton, who was a patient man, had said he'd keep the offer open. Matthew kept meaning to make a decision and kept failing to make it, which was unlike him, and he was honest enough with himself to know why. He came out to her property 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes he had a practical reason, a task she needed help with, something to do with the ongoing cattle arrangements for the Holt estate that brought him out that direction anyway. And sometimes he had no reason at all except that he wanted to see her, and after the first few times she stopped asking him what had brought him out and simply made room for him in whatever she was doing. She had him help her expand the lower garden bed, digging out the rocky soil, and laying down the flat stone borders she had been planning. She showed him the irrigation scheme she had been drawing out on paper, the rough network of channels she wanted to cut from the well to the lower field, and he bent over her drawings at the kitchen table and studied them with genuine interest, and suggested one modification to the main channel angle that would improve the water flow. And she had looked at the drawing for a long moment and said, "You are right," with the simple, direct willingness of a person who had no ego invested in being wrong. He helped her dig the first section of the main channel on a hot Thursday morning, and they worked through the worst of the heat and rested in the shade of the Linta barn in the early afternoon with cold water from the well. And she told him about Ohio, about growing up in a small town on the edge of the farming country there, about the way the light was different from Arizona lights, softer, greener, more filtered, and how she had not expected to love the harshness of this landscape but had come to love it anyway. When did that change, he asked. When did it stop feeling harsh and start feeling like home? She thought about it. About 2 years in, she said. There was a morning in late winter when I came out to check on the well, and the sun was coming up behind the red rocks and everything was pink and gold and completely still, and I thought, this is mine. Not the sky or the rocks, the feeling of it, the belonging to it. She paused. I do not know if that makes sense. Yes, he said, it does. He had his own version of this. He had grown up in Texas, had worked cattle across 3 territories, and the belonging he had found was not to any single place, but to the country itself, to the particular quality of the western light and the enormous sky, and the way the land changed beneath you as you moved through it. He had been moving through it for most of his life, and he had not, until recently, been entirely clear on whether he was looking for something or simply moving, because he did not know how to stop. He was becoming clearer on it. He was sitting on her porch one evening in early September, the two of them with coffee again as the sun went down. This had become a habit, the evening coffee on the porch, a ritual that neither of them had named or formalized because naming it might have made it too fragile. When she looked sideways at him and said, "Are you staying in Raydrock Crossing, Matthew?" It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it the way you notice a shift in the light. "I have not decided," he said, which was honest. She looked back at the sunset. "There is work here," she said. "The town is growing. There are 3 new homesteads on the north side that have all filed claims in the last year. Tom Garfield at the livery is looking for a reliable hand. And Bill Creasy, who runs the small freight operation, has been talking about needing someone who knows cattle transport." She said all of this without looking at him, in a perfectly even voice that was giving him information, and was not, explicitly, making any request. He looked at her profile in the evening light, the straight line of her nose, the firm set of her mouth, the fine lines at her eyes that he had come to think of as evidence of all the squinting at difficult situations she had survived, and he thought, "Here is a woman who will not ask you to stay. She will tell you the practical reasons, and she will leave the conclusion to you, because she has been managing this land alone for 3 years, and she does not know how to lean on someone, and she is not sure she wants to learn. And if you are going to be here, you are going to have to decide that for yourself. I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that Flagstaff might not be where I need to be." She turned to look at him then, and her expression was guarded and open at the same time, which was a combination he had come to recognize as specific to her, the guard that 3 years of fighting alone had built, and the openness underneath it that she had not managed to entirely extinguish. "I have been thinking," he continued, "that this is a good piece of country, and that I have been passing through pieces of good country for 10 years without stopping. And now," she said, very quietly. "And now," he said, "I am wondering whether I have been looking for a reason to stop." The silence between them stretched out across the cooling air of the evening, across the smell of dust and juniper and the distant sage, and she looked at him for a long time. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not a simple arrangement. I have my own land and my own plans, and I have been managing both for a long time on my own terms." "I know that," he said, "and I am not," she paused, choosing words, "I am not the kind of woman who will make herself smaller to fit alongside someone else. I learned that lesson when I married Edgar, who was a good man but who expected that marriage meant I would defer to his judgment on every matter, and I was young enough that I tried to do that for a while, and I was not very good at it. 'I would not ask that of you,' he said, and then very simply, 'Susan,' her name in his mouth, the first time. She breathed in slowly. She looked at the last light fading over the rocks. 'All right,' she said softly, as though she were answering a question he had asked, though neither of them was entirely sure which question. He stayed. He sent a letter to Creighton in Flagstaff explaining that his plans had changed. He had a brief, uncomfortable conversation with Mrs. Harmon at the hotel, who looked at him very seriously and said that Susan Whitfield was not a woman to be trifled with, and that she had been through enough. And he met her gaze and said that he understood that, and that he had no intention of being another difficult thing in her life. Mrs. Harmon had studied him for a long moment and then nodded once, with the air of someone granting provisional approval that could be revoked. He took the arrangement with Tom Garfield at the livery, a part-time agreement, 3 mornings a week, and on call for larger jobs, which gave him enough income to stay at the hotel while he figured out the shape of what came next. He was careful about how he handled that question of his living arrangements, because he was aware that in a small frontier town there were conventions that mattered and that Susan's reputation was part of the fabric of her life here, and he was not going to damage it by being careless. He spent his days partly at the livery and partly at Susan's property, helping with the next stages of the irrigation project. The channel was coming along well. They had cut the main line and two of the secondary channels, and when the first real test came and the water ran from the well into the field, Susan had stood at the end of the main channel with her hat in her hand and watched the water move through the dry earth, and her face had done something extraordinary. Not quite tears, but something near them, something bright and fierce and entirely her own. He stood a few steps back and gave her that moment to herself. She turned after a while and looked at him. "You helped me do this," she said. "You designed it," he said. "I just dug." "Do not minimize it," she said firmly, and there was something very like affection in her firmness. He came to know the rhythms of her days, the early rising, the morning round of chores before the heat came in, the midday rest that was brief and grudging, the afternoon work that pushed as late as the light allowed. He came to know the way she thought through problems, which was to talk about them until she had worked out her position, and then to state that position and not deviate from it unless presented with a genuinely superior argument. He came to know the books she kept on that shelf above the fireplace, novels mostly, though there was a natural history of the American Southwest and a dog-eared almanac that she consulted with great seriousness. He came to know the way she laughed, which was infrequent but very real when it happened, a full, warm sound that she seemed to produce without quite meaning to, and that always startled her slightly, as though she had been living so long in the management of serious things that laughter was a small gift she had forgotten she was allowed. He made her laugh more often than she expected him to. He had a dry, observational humor that came at things sideways, and she responded to it like a plant that had not had enough water, not dramatically, not with great display, but with the gradual turning of something toward the light. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday evening in mid-October. They had been to a community gathering in Red Rock Crossing. The town held them occasionally, a practical affair that served as a social and civic function simultaneously, where people brought dishes and ate together and discussed matters of common concern, the water rights issue that was developing to the north, the question of whether the town should petition for a post road, the new families who had arrived and needed to be brought into the general knowledge of the community. Susan was known and respected there, which he saw clearly. People came to her, sought her opinion, listened when she spoke. She navigated it with the same directness she brought to everything, and he watched her and thought, this is what she has been this whole time. Not just a woman surviving, but a woman with a place and a standing in the world she has built. On the ride back he had said something to that effect, not quite in those terms, but something about what he had observed, and she had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I was not always as sure of myself as I appear to be." "Neither was I," he said. "But you do not have to have been sure to have arrived somewhere solid." She looked at him in the moonlight. The Arizona night was cool now, the summer heat long gone, and she was wearing her heavy coat, and there was something about her face in that silver-gray light, the steadiness and the vulnerability existing simultaneously, as they always did in her, that made him stop his horse, and she stopped hers and looked at him questioningly. "I would like to kiss you," he said, "if you will allow it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," she said, simply that. He leaned across from his horse to hers and kissed her very gently, with all the patience he had in him, and she was still for a moment and then kissed him back. And it was not a tentative thing. Whatever she did, she was not tentative. It was not in her nature, but it was careful and present and very real. When they drew back, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, something new and unguarded, and he thought, there she is. There is the part of her she does not show the town. "All right," she said again, very softly. He understood that she was not just acknowledging the kiss. She was acknowledging everything that came with it, all the risk and the vulnerability and the possibility. And she was deciding, with the same deliberate precision she brought to her irrigation plans, to let it in. He courted her with the care she deserved. He did not rush, because she had made it clear in 100 small ways that her trust was not freely given, and he did not want it freely given, he wanted it earned. He brought her things that had practical meaning. a better grade of fence wire from the supply wagon that came through in November, a book he had found at the general store that was a more detailed agricultural guide than the almanac she was relying on. He fixed her porch steps, which had been soft in one corner, without making a production of it. He was there, consistently, in the way that mattered most to a woman who had learned not to count on people, and he talked to her. This turned out to be the most important thing. Not flattery, not professions, not the kind of talk men sometimes used as a form of pressure, just genuine conversation, the kind that required him to be actually present and actually listening and actually thinking about what she had said. He told her about his own life, his boyhood in East Texas, working his father's small farm until his father died, and there was not enough farm left after the debts to keep, the years of driving cattle and learning every corner of the western country, the things he had been looking for without quite knowing he was looking. She listened the way she did everything, with full attention and without judgment. In December, he moved out of the hotel. The winter was coming, the high desert cold settling in with a seriousness that required preparation, and there was more work to be done on her property than he could helpfully do if he was riding in from town every day. He had a conversation with her about it that was entirely practical and also, beneath the practicality, one of the most significant conversations they had. He was going to build a small cabin on the east end of her property, which was well within the bounds of the land she owned. He would pay for his own materials. It would be his structure on her land, and the arrangement would be whatever they decided it to be. She had thought about it for 2 full days before she answered him. He had not pressed her. When she came to him at the livery on the second afternoon and said, "Build your cabin," there was something in the way she said it that told him she had not just been thinking about the cabin. He built it in 3 weeks, working every day, and various men in the town helped when they could because that was what you did when someone was building a place to live. Tom Garfield came 2 Saturdays. A man named Cole Williams, who was homesteading to the north, came and worked for a full week, and Matthew helped him with a project of his own the following week in return. Bill Creasy came and contributed materials he had extra of and did not want to haul back. Mrs. Harmon sent food. Susan worked alongside him when she was not doing her own chores, carrying timber, holding planks while he nailed them, making decisions about where the window should face. It was a small cabin, 1 room, a stone fireplace, a solid roof, but it was well built because Matthew Finley did not do things halfway, and when it was done it was a real structure, something that would last. He moved into it on a cold night in January of 1875, with his few possessions arranged with the spare economy of a man used to traveling light, and when the fire was going and the small space was warm he went to Susan's porch and knocked, and she came to the door and said, "Well, it is good," he said. "Come see." She pulled her coat on over her nightgown without ceremony and walked across the frost-stiff ground with him to the cabin and stepped inside and looked around at everything. The fire, the single window set in the west wall where he had placed it for the evening light, the bookshelves he had built empty now but built, and the wide, solid work table under the window. She stood in the middle of the room and he watched her take it in. "This is real," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked at him, and for a moment the firelight was the only thing between them, and the cold pressed in at the walls, and the whole world outside was dark and enormous and indifferent. But in here it was warm, and they were both exactly where they had decided to be. He took her hand, which he did sometimes now, and she let him hold it, which she did sometimes now, and they stood in his small cabin on her land and looked at the fire. The spring of 1875 came in slowly, warming degree by degree the way the Arizona spring did, and the world opened up around them like something that had been clenched and was finally letting go. Susan's lower field was planted with the benefit of the completed irrigation system, and by April it was the greenest thing for a mile in any direction. Matthew had taken on additional work with Bill Creasy's freight operation, 3 days a week now, helping organize cattle transport down to Tucson, which used his skills and his knowledge of the country, and he was making a decent living, and had begun to put some money aside with a purpose he had not yet spoken aloud. He spoke it at the end of April. They were sitting in her kitchen after supper, across the table from each other, and she was working on some accounts. The record-keeping she did with meticulous care, every expenditure and every income recorded in a ledger that was one of the better organized documents he had ever seen, and he was reading one of her books, and it was an ordinary evening, the kind they had been having for months now, and in the middle of it he said, "Susan." She looked up from her ledger. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to hear it through before you respond." She put down her pen. She folded her hands on the ledger. Her expression was attentive and steady, which was the most he could ask of her. "I love you," he said. "I have known this for a while, and I have been working out how to say it in a way that did not come with any pressure or expectation. I am saying it now because I think you should know it, and because I am not a man who is comfortable keeping important truths to himself for too long." He paused. "I want to marry you if you will have me. But I want you to understand that I mean to marry you, specifically, and not some arrangement or some idea. I mean to marry a woman who runs her own land and makes her own decisions and has opinions that are worth arguing with and who laughs at things that are genuinely funny and who is building something here that I think is remarkable. I do not want to take any of that from you. I want to be alongside it." She was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "You said you wanted me to hear it through before I respond." "I did say that," he agreed. "Are you finished?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She breathed slowly. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the accounts open between them and the fire going in the fireplace and the night sound of the desert outside, the coyote somewhere to the west, the wind in the juniper, the enormous quiet, and she looked at him for what felt like a very long time. "I love you too," she said at last, very quietly, as though she had tested the words in her own mind first, and found that they were true, and that this surprised her somewhat, and that she had decided to say it anyway. "I have been aware of it for longer than I care to admit, which is probably characteristic of me." He was smiling now, the warm, full smile she had come to think of as specifically hers, the one that lived behind his usual quietness. "And yes," she said, "I will marry you." She did not rush toward him or make any dramatic gesture. She simply reached across the ledger and put her hand in his, palm up, and he wrapped his fingers around it and held it. "Good," he said. "You will have to build on," she said after a moment. "The house, I mean. It is too small as it is, and I will not give up my study." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about the addition." She pulled her hand back and picked up her pen again and said, "Finish reading your book. I have to balance these figures." He did. He could not stop smiling. They married in June of 1875, in a ceremony at the small church in Redrock Crossing that was attended by most of the town. Mrs. Harmon had organized a reception dinner with the characteristic efficiency of a woman who ran a hotel and did not tolerate disorder, and the dining room of the hotel was decorated with desert wildflowers and sage. And there was food that people had contributed from their own stores, because that was what you did in a frontier community when one of your own had something to celebrate. Susan wore a dress that she had made herself from blue silk that a traveling merchant had sold her, a deeper blue than the cotton dress she had worn to supper months ago, and fitted properly, and with a small spray of pale wildflowers at the collar. She looked, Matthew thought, as though she had not dressed up but had simply become more fully visible, the way a landscape looks when the cloud shadow passes over it and the color comes back. He wore his good coat and his best hat, and had had his hair cut by the barber, who had said absolutely nothing during the whole proceeding, which was a remarkable restraint for that particular man. The vows, they said, were the traditional ones, but when they reached the part about love and cherish, Matthew added, unscripted, quietly enough that only she could hear, "And I promise to be someone worth trusting." She had looked at him with those dark blue-gray eyes and had added, equally quiet, "And I promise to let myself be helped, two promises that meant more between the two of them than the formal words on either side of them. They walked out of the church into the full blaze of the Arizona summer, and she took his arm with a naturalness that said she had finally, genuinely decided to let this be real, and he covered her hand with his, and they walked into the rest of it. The house addition was completed by late summer, 2 more rooms on the south side, the study that she had claimed as her own from the beginning and the larger bedroom that was now theirs, properly fitted and solid and built to last. The cabin on the east end became a workspace where Matthew dealt with his freight organization records and his livestock paperwork, which suited both of them. They each had their domain, and they came together in the shared spaces with intention rather than obligation. Her land flourished. The irrigation system's second season produced results she had not dared project in her most optimistic estimates. The lower field gave a yield that more than covered the season's costs, and left a margin she had not had before. Matthew's freight and cattle work brought in a reliable income that took some of the pressure off the homestead in the lean months, which meant she could make longer-term decisions rather than only immediate ones. She bought 2 cows in the fall, a practical investment she had been planning for 2 years, and the small dairy operation that grew from them over the following year added another layer to the homestead's stability. She also acquired, in the fall of 1875, an unexpected additional matter to manage. She told him in October, sitting on the porch in the evening as they were becoming a thing, a settled, married couple with their coffee and their conversation and the desert going dark around them, that she was going to have a child. She told him in exactly the way she did everything directly, looking at him, having already thought through the practical implications, and arrived at a position of cautious optimism. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment, and then he reached for her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and she looked back at him and her face did the thing it had done when the water ran through the irrigation channel for the first time, something bright and fierce and entirely her own. "Well," she said finally, practical as always, "we will need to plan." "We will," he said. He was still holding her hand. He was having some difficulty speaking with complete evenness, which was unusual for him, and she noticed it and looked at him more carefully and saw on his face something she had not expected, a pure, undisguised joy that he had not had time to manage into composure, and it undid something in her completely. She leaned across the porch chair and put her head against his shoulder, which was not something she did often, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that while the stars came out, and she was thinking about everything that was coming, and he was thinking about how very much he had not known he was looking for when he rode into Reed Rock Crossing a year ago on a job about cattle. Their son was born in the early morning of March the 3rd, 1876, after a labor that lasted most of the previous night, and that Susan managed with the same grim, absolute determination she brought to everything difficult. Mrs. Harmon had come out to the homestead the week before the child was due and stayed, because she had delivered babies before, and because she was not going to leave Susan to manage without her. The doctor from Reed Rock Crossing was there too, a young man named Aldous who was competent and careful. Matthew spent the night on the porch, because they sent him out and he would not have been useful anyway, and he sat in the dark with the cold and the stars and the sounds coming from inside the house that he could not stop listening to, and he thought about every choice that had led him to this particular night, this porch, this woman, and the life they were making together. When the baby cried, he stood up. When Mrs. Harmon came to the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Finley, you have a son," he went in. Susan was exhausted and pale and completely herself, propped against the pillows with the infant in her arms. She looked at Matthew when he came in, and the look on his face was something she kept for the rest of her life, kept it the way you keep a particular quality of light in your memory, pure and unguarded and enormous. He came and sat beside her and looked at his son, who was red and squinting and very loudly announcing his displeasure at the general circumstances of having arrived, and Matthew reached out one careful finger and touched the child's cheek, and the child quieted momentarily as though acknowledging the introduction. "He looks like himself," Susan said, which was her very practical way of saying she was glad and overwhelmed and grateful. "Yes," Matthew said. His voice was not quite steady. "What will we call him?" She had thought about this. "James," she said. "For my father, James Edgar Finley, if that suits you." "James Edgar Finley," he repeated. "Yes, that suits me very well." James Edgar Finley was a solid, dark-eyed child who grew with the same steady determination as everything else on the homestead, and who was, by his first birthday, already crawling through the garden beds, investigating things that interested him, with the focused curiosity of someone who had arrived in the world with opinions. Matthew watched his son in the garden and felt something settle in him that he had not known was unsettled, something deep and permanent. The sense of having arrived at a place that was genuinely his, not by default or by wandering but by choice, made deliberately and well. The town of Redrock Crossing grew in those years. The Post Road petition had been successful, and by 1876 there was regular mail service and the beginnings of a more formal town structure. A county sheriff had been appointed, a man named Briggs who was competent and fair, and there was talk of a school, which Susan Whitfield, now Finley, though she sometimes still answered to Whitfield, because old habits and old identities were not things to be discarded entirely, had opinions about, and had brought to the community meetings with the same quiet force she brought to everything. She was on the committee that organized the school's establishment. She helped select the teacher, a young woman from Illinois named Agnes Harrington, who was composed and serious and proved very good at the work. She helped organize the building, contributed materials from her own supplies, and was the person everyone expected to attend the first day and who did, with James on her hip and Matthew beside her, watching the children file into the new building with an expression that was not sentimental in any obvious way, but that was very present. Franklin Holt's land was purchased by a family named Pierce who came out from New Mexico in the spring of 1876. A man and his wife and 2 grown sons, all of them hardworking and reasonable. The Pierces became neighbors in the truest sense, cooperative and mutually helpful in the way that the best frontier neighbors were. The boundary line that had been the source of 3 years of Susan's misery became simply a boundary line, unremarkable, crossed in both directions in the course of ordinary neighborly business. She thought sometimes about standing at Franklin Holt's grave, weeping without understanding why. She had come to understand it better in the time since. She had wept because 3 years of her life had been organized around an enemy, and the enemy was gone, and she had not known who she was without him. She had wept for the exhaustion of fighting, and for the Edgar-shaped absence that she had spent 3 years filling with work and struggle, and the singular heat of having something to be angry at. She had wept because she was alone, and did not know she was about to stop being alone. She wept, in other words, because she had been in the last dark moment before the light changed. She told Matthew this one evening, more than a year into their marriage, sitting at the kitchen table while James slept in the next room and the accounts were balanced and the ledger was closed for the night, and she said, "I have been thinking about that day. At the grave." He looked at her. He waited. "I think I was mourning something that was not him," she said. "I was mourning the version of myself that had been defined by fighting him, and I was mourning Edgar still, even then. And I was mourning the years before all of it when I was young and did not know yet what the world could cost you." He nodded slowly. "And then I rode up," he said. "And then you rode up," she agreed. "And you did not ask me anything, you just stood there. It seemed like what the moment wanted," he said. She looked at him. "It was exactly what the moment wanted," she said. "I think if you had asked me anything, I would have shut down and ridden home, and I might never have let myself be found." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I did not want you to feel found," he said. "I just did not want you to be alone." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the way she had done on the night she agreed to marry him, palm up, and he turned his hand over and held it. "You did not know me," she said. You had no reason to care whether I was alone." "No," he agreed. "But I looked at you and I thought, here is someone carrying something very heavy, and there is nothing for me to do with that except to stand here so there is at least another person in the world aware of it." She was quiet. The fire crackled. James made a small sound in the other room and then settled back into sleep. "That is a generous thing to do for a stranger," she said. "I suppose it is," he said. "But you have not been a stranger since about 30 seconds after I met you." She looked at him with those dark blue-gray eyes, and she was doing the thing he loved most, the thing where the guard came down and the person underneath it was fully present, looking back at him without management or strategy, just herself. "I am glad you did not ask any questions," she said. "So am I," he said. There was a quality to the years that followed that Susan would later find difficult to describe to anyone who had not lived something similar. Not because the words were unavailable to her, she was a woman of considerable language, but because the texture of it was in the ordinary details, the accumulation of days that were mostly unremarkable and entirely good. The seasons turning in the Arizona country, the irrigation channels running in spring and summer, the harvest in fall, the cold, clear winters when the desert went austere and beautiful, and the fire in the house was the warmest thing in 40 miles. James growing, first into a toddler who treated the garden as a personal investigation ground, then into a boy who followed Matthew around with the concentrated attention of someone studying a craft, asking questions about the livestock and the freight routes and the mechanics of things with an appetite for information that Susan recognized as coming from her. Matthew loved his son with a steadiness and a presence that Susan watched with the particular gratitude of a woman who had known men who were not present in that way. He did not make a production of it. He simply showed up for the daily things and for the significant ones, for the skinned knees and the first lost tooth, and the afternoon James fell off the fence he had been explicitly told not to climb and lay crying in the yard with a broken arm, and Matthew had him at the doctor in Redrock Crossing within the hour, calm and focused the whole way, only allowing himself a moment of leaning against the doctor's wall outside, with his eyes closed when the arm was set, and James was inside eating the candy the doctor gave all children after unpleasant procedures. Susan had put her hand on his back and he had straightened up immediately, but she had seen it, that brief human moment of having been scared and then released, and she had felt for him then something she could not easily name, a deep and tender knowing of exactly who he was. Their daughter arrived in the fall of 1878, and they named her Ruth Mary Finley Ruth for Mrs. Harmon, who had been at every difficult moment, and who received the news with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had given up expecting that life would acknowledge her contributions, and was therefore particularly moved when it did. Mary was a smaller, more immediately sociable child than James had been, with her father's amber eyes and her mother's particular set to her jaw that said she had arrived with opinions and would be sharing them. Mrs. Harmon came to see the baby and held her for a long time and did not say anything and did not need to. By 1879, the Finley homestead, it was called that now by the whole district, the Finley homestead, though Susan insisted on keeping her original land claim filed in her name as a matter of principle, and Matthew supported this without any drama, was one of the most productive small operations in that corner of the territory. The cattle Susan had purchased had grown to a small herd of 9, managed in rotation with the cropland. The lower field with the irrigation system had been expanded twice. There was a proper barn now, large enough for the horses and the cattle and the hay stores for winter. Matthew had gradually wound down the freight work as the homestead became sufficient to support them without the additional income, and had shifted to a more concentrated arrangement with the livestock side. He did occasional consulting for other ranchers in the region, advising on herd management and cattle transport, which used his knowledge, and kept him connected to the broader network of the territory without requiring him to travel far. He was not, he reflected sometimes, a man who had ever expected to be rooted. He had spent too many years moving to believe that rootedness was something he was capable of. But here he was, and the roots had gone down without him noticing. And when he rode out onto the land in the early morning, any season, the light always doing something remarkable, and came back to the house where Susan was already in the kitchen and James was either up and into something, or would be shortly, and Ruth was making the specific noise from her crib that meant she had been awake for exactly as long as she was prepared to be patient. He came back to it the way you come back to something you know is yours, not with surprise anymore, but with the solid, unspectacular pleasure of a man who has found his place and knows it. Susan expanded her garden in the spring of 1879. Adding a small orchard. Fruit trees were a slow investment. It would be years before they produced anything meaningful, but she had planned them on paper for 2 years, and the planning was over and it was time. Matthew helped her plant the 6 young trees on the south slope where the light was best, and she stood back and looked at them, 6 slender sticks in the red Arizona earth, and said, "By the time Ruth is old enough to climb trees, these will be large enough to climb. James will have them half destroyed before then," Matthew said. "James will not touch the orchard," Susan said, with a certainty that was entirely convincing. James, who was 3.5 at the time and was standing nearby, ostensibly helping by handing his mother small stones to fill around the tree roots, looked up with the expression of a child who understood more of the conversation than adults typically assumed, and decided wisely to say nothing. The school in Raydrock Crossing had grown to 2 rooms and a dedicated building by 1879, and Agnes Harrington had proven so capable that she had been joined by an assistant teacher, a quiet young man named Peters who taught the older students mathematics with an enthusiasm they mostly found baffling but occasionally infectious. Susan was still on the school committee and attended the meetings with the focused engagement of a woman who had come to believe, through her own experience of managing a land dispute, that civic participation was not optional if you wanted your community to be the kind of place worth living in. She had also, quietly and without announcement, helped 2 other women in the district with their own land claims. A widow named Henderson, who had homesteaded 6 miles to the south, and run into the same kind of paperwork obstruction that Susan had faced years ago. A young woman named Clara Voss, who had come west with a husband who had left within the first year, and who had decided to stay and file her own claim rather than go back east to a family that had not particularly wanted her to leave. Susan had navigated the legal complexity with them, using her own hard-won knowledge of the land office process and her Tucson lawyer, and both women had secured their claims. Matthew had watched this and said, on the evening after the Henderson matter was resolved, "You are going to help every woman in the district who has a land problem." "I might," she said, with the equanimity of someone who has accepted this as a natural extension of what they do. "That is a good thing," he said. "I know," she said simply. He looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight with the sounds of their children sleeping and the fire and the desert outside, and he thought, not for the first time, that he had not known what he was riding toward when he came to Raydrock Crossing in the fall of 1874. He had thought he was going about cattle. He had arrived at something so much larger than that, and it had grown in him the way the orchard trees would grow slowly, with deep roots, into something that would stand. He thought about telling her this and decided that she probably knew it, because she had proven to know most things about him. "Susan," he said. She looked up from the account she was reviewing. "I was thinking about the first day," he said. She set down her pen. She knew what he meant. "At the grave," he said. "I have been thinking about what brought me there that morning. I was supposed to be in town. I had told Tom I would be at the livery by 9. I rode out the long way toward the Holt property, and I have never been entirely certain why." She looked at him carefully. "What do you think the reason was?" she asked. He considered it. "I think I was not ready to be in town," he said. "I think I was having one of those mornings where the wide-open country is what you need, and you do not know why. And I rode out the long way through the junipers, and I came out into the clearing by the cemetery, and I saw you." She was very still. "I saw you and I thought, this is a person in a real moment," he said. "Not a performed moment, not a public moment, a real one. And I thought the only decent thing to do was to be very quiet." "And you were," she said softly. "And you were at the grave of the man who had made your life difficult for 3 years," he said. "And you were crying, and I did not know why exactly, and it did not matter. The why did not matter," she breathed slowly. "No," she said, "it did not." He got up from his chair and came around the table and bent down and kissed her carefully and warmly, and she put her hand up and held the side of his face, which she did sometimes, this specific gesture that was entirely hers, and when he straightened she looked at him with that look, the one without management, without the guard, all the way in. "I am glad it was you who rode up that morning," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." The decade turned, and the Arizona Territory continued to change around them. The railroad came closer, the towns grew, the open range was filling in with fence lines and filed claims, and the complex, sometimes painful negotiations of a frontier becoming something more settled. There were injustices in it. The displacement of the peoples who had been on this land before any white settler arrived was a fact that Matthew and Susan were aware of, and that the land itself seemed to remember in ways the new arrivals sometimes pretended not to notice. The Apache bands who had moved through this country for generations were being pushed steadily into smaller territories by treaty arrangements that benefited the federal government and the expanding settler population. And Matthew, who had traveled widely enough and seen enough to know the history, did not pretend that the homestead they had built was uncomplicated in its origins. He talked about this with Susan, who was a woman who did not flinch from uncomfortable truths, and they talked about it with their children as the children grew old enough to hear it, that the land was beautiful and that they were grateful for it, and that the history of it was not simple, and that knowing that was important. James, at 8 years old, absorbed this with the same focused curiosity he brought to everything, and asked questions about the Apache people's way of life with an interest that was genuine rather than performative. And Susan found him books that had been written on the subject, and Matthew told him what he had observed in his years of traveling the territory, and they did not pretend the world was simpler than it was. Ruth, at 5, was more focused on the orchard trees, which were now, true to Susan's prediction, large enough to climb, though Susan maintained that they were not for climbing, and maintained this position with the conviction of a woman who knew she was fighting a losing battle and intended to fight it anyway. In the spring of 1880, Susan discovered she was expecting again. She told Matthew in the evening, sitting on the porch, the way she always told him important things directly, looking at him, having already thought about it. He looked at her for a moment and then smiled. The warm, full smile that she had come to believe was one of the finest things she had ever had the occasion to cause. "Good," he said. "You always say good," she said. "Because it always is," he said. She considered him. After a moment she said, "I was thinking if it is another boy I would like to name him for you." He was quiet for a moment. "Matthew," he said, as though testing it. "Matthew William Finley," she said. "William was your father's name." He looked at her, and she saw something move through his face that she had not often seen from him, a nakedness of feeling, brief and deep, the emotion of a man who has carried the name of a dead father quietly for a long time and has not expected anyone to think to honor it. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He reached across the space between their chairs, and she met his hand halfway, the way they always did, the way that had become the particular signature of what they were to each other, neither one reaching all the way, both of them meeting in the middle. The third child arrived in late October of 1880, and he was Matthew William Finley, called Will almost immediately to distinguish him from his father. a small, red-headed child who had managed to produce hair that was neither Susan's dark brown nor Matthew's dark brown, but was an entirely unexpected reddish gold that delighted both of them, and seemed to delight Will himself when he eventually became old enough to notice it in a reflection. Mrs. Harmon, who came for the birth as she had for all three, held Will and said, "Well, that is something different," in the tone of someone confronted with agreeable variety. The homestead in the winter of 1880 was warm and full. 3 children, the oldest of whom was nearly 5, and conducted himself with the authority of someone very certain of his position in the family hierarchy. A barn full of livestock that were wintering well. A larder that was full enough that Susan had, for the first time, felt genuinely comfortable about the winter rather than simply prepared to manage it. A house that had been added to and repaired, and was now a real home, with the books on their shelves and the quilt on the chair, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the specific aliveness of a place where people were fully present. Matthew sat on the porch one cold December night, the air sharp and clean, the stars overwhelming in their quantity the way they were on cloudless winter nights in the desert. And he thought about the man he had been when he arrived here 6 years ago, moving through, as he always had, not quite looking for anything, not quite at rest. He thought about the woman he had found at a grave, weeping in a way that was not simple grief, and about the choice he had made to simply stand beside her and not make anything of it. He thought about all the small moments that had come after, that had accumulated like the red dust on the fence posts, quietly and inevitably, into this life. He heard the door open behind him, and Susan came out with her coat on, 2 cups of coffee, and gave him one and settled into the chair beside him and pulled her coat closer. The night was very quiet. Inside, the children were sleeping. The fire was banked and warm. The orchard trees were dark shapes against the lighter darkness of the sky, bare in winter but alive beneath the surface, already preparing for what spring would ask of them. She said nothing for a while. He said nothing. They drank their coffee in the December cold and looked at the stars. "Matthew," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," she said slowly, choosing her words as she always did, "that this is not what I expected my life to be." He turned to look at her. "When I came west in '66, she said, "with Edgar I had a particular picture in my mind of what a life looked like. A house, land, children, the work of building something. I had that picture, and it was a reasonable picture, and when Edgar died the picture broke. Not the individual parts of it, but the whole shape of it." She paused. "And I spent 3 years holding the parts together by force without the shape." He waited. "And now," she said, "I have a different shape. One I did not picture because I did not know it was possible." She looked at him steadily in the winter starlight. "It is better than the picture I had," she said, "considerably." He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail and reached across and took her hand, and she let him hold it as she always let him hold it, and they sat in the cold December night of the Arizona Territory in the year 1880, under the stars and the bare orchard trees and the enormous western sky. And the life they had built between them was all around them in every direction, solid and warm and completely theirs. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said. The same plain, direct way she had said it the first time. No less true for being said again. More true, perhaps, for all the ordinary days that had been poured into it since. The wind moved over the desert and the stars went on burning overhead, indifferent and beautiful, the way they always had been and always would be, and Matthew Finley and Susan Whitfield sat together on the porch of the house they had made and were still, and the night held them, and it was enough, more than enough, it was everything. In the years that followed, the Finley homestead became a known thing in that part of the territory, not famous, not legendary, but known in the way that solid and lasting things become known. People pointed it out to newcomers, said it was one of the earliest established homesteads in the district, mentioned that Mrs. Finley was the person to talk to about land filings, and that her husband knew more about cattle transport than anyone for 50 miles. James grew into a serious, capable young man who helped on the homestead and showed signs of wanting to read law, which his mother supported with a fervor that surprised no one who knew her. Ruth grew into a girl with her father's eyes and her mother's iron will, who was going to be, everyone agreed, a very interesting woman in about 15 years. Will developed a cheerful, gregarious energy that was not quite like either parent but that fit perfectly into the family, the reddish-haired middle of three, the one who knew everyone in town by name and was known by all of them with equal warmth. Matthew at 38 was content, in a way he would not have been able to describe to his younger self, not the contentment of complacency, not the settling of a man who had given up, but the contentment of a man who had found his true work and was doing it, who had found his true place and was in it, who had found the person he wanted to be alongside and was alongside her every day. Susan at 34 had a homestead that was thriving and a family that was growing and a reputation in the community that she had earned through years of practical, unglamorous engagement with the real problems of real people. She had helped 4 women navigate the land claim process now. She had been on every civic committee worth being on. She had read most of the books on the shelf and was always looking for more. She had laughed more in the years with Matthew than in all the years before them, and this was a thing she valued deeply, more than she had ever expected to value it. She thought sometimes about Franklin Holt less and less often as the years went by. She did not think about him with anger anymore. She thought about him with something closer to pity, though not the condescending kind. She thought, there was a man who organized his life around taking things from others, and what did he end up with? A grave in the corner of a property that passed to strangers, and a sister and a nephew who drove away as soon as the funeral was over. She thought, I organized my life around building something, and look at what I have built. And then she stopped thinking about him and went back to what she was doing, which was always something worth doing. The winter of 1882 brought a cold that was unusual even for the high desert, a real cold that came down hard and lasted, and they managed it the way they managed everything, together, working the problem, keeping the livestock through and the house warm and the children fed and healthy. James was 7 now and genuinely useful, and Ruth at 4 was beginning to be useful in specific ways, and Will at 2 was useful primarily to the extent that he could be kept from the more hazardous aspects of the operation, which was itself a project that required some management. On the worst night of that cold stretch, when the temperature had dropped below anything they had charted before, and the wind was coming off the high country with a particular ruthlessness, Matthew came in from the barn at midnight after checking on the livestock and found Susan still up by the fire, feeding it carefully, managing the heat with the same attention she managed everything. She had wrapped Will in extra blankets in his crib near the fire and had checked on James and Ruth, and she was sitting with a cup of tea and the almanac, reading the weather predictions for the following week with a focused expression. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, stamping the cold off his boots, and looked at her by the firelight. 36 years old, her dark hair going very slightly silver at the temples now. The fine lines at her eyes that had been forming when he first met her deepened now and entirely suited to her face, the almanac in her hands, her expression calm and practical and absolutely, entirely herself. He thought, I am the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory. She looked up from the almanac and saw him standing there and said, How are they? They are all right, he said. I put extra hay down and the body heat of the herd will keep the temperature in the barn manageable. She nodded, satisfied. Come warm up, she said. There is tea. He came to the fire and took the tea she poured for him and sat across from her, and she went back to the almanac, and he watched the fire and felt the cold leaving him, and outside the wind blew across the Arizona desert with all its old, magnificent indifference, and inside it was warm and they were together, and everything that needed to be built had been built. Susan, he said. She looked up. He looked at her across the fire and she looked back at him, and there was no particular occasion for it, no anniversary or milestone, just a cold night and a fire and the two of them and the sleeping children and the whole long good life they had made, and he said, very simply, "I am glad I rode the long way that morning." She looked at him for a moment. Then the smile came, the real one, the full one, the rare and true laugh-adjacent version of it that he had spent years learning to produce, that he treasured every time it appeared. "So am I," she said. They sat together in the warm kitchen while the Arizona winter roared outside and the fire burned and the children slept and the orchard trees stood bare and patient in the frozen dark, waiting, as all growing things wait, for the season to turn again, and for what spring would bring. It always brought something good,